The carriage struck a stone in the road, and Eleanor Whitmore nearly bit through her tongue. She had been rehearsing her wedding vows for the 40th time when the wheel dropped into the rut, and now her mouth tasted of copper, and her nerves felt worse than before. Outside the window, the towers of Ashcombe Hall rose gray and silent against a sky heavy with rain that had not yet decided to fall. She had never seen a house so large. She had never seen a man so cold as the one she was about to marry, if the servant's letters her aunt had shown her were to be believed. Duke Julian Ashcombe had not smiled in 7 years. That was what people said. Not at his own birthday, not at the harvest fair his family had funded for 3 generations, not even, some whispered, at his own mother's remarriage abroad. Eleanor did not know if it was true. She only knew that in 2 hours she would be his wife, and she had never spoken to him for longer than the length of one formal letter. Her maid, Sally, reached across the carriage and squeezed her gloved hand. "You look as though you are going to your own funeral, miss." "I feel rather as though I am," Eleanor said, and immediately regretted it, because saying true things aloud was one of her worst habits, and one her mother had warned her about since childhood. "A lady does not say what she thinks," her mother used to tell her. "A lady says what is expected." Eleanor had never quite learned the difference. The carriage rolled through the gates, past hedgerows cut into perfect shapes, past a fountain gone dry, and stopped before a set of stone steps where a line of servants stood waiting like soldiers at inspection. At the top of the steps stood a man in dark gray, tall, still, his hands folded behind his back. Even from this distance, Eleanor could see that he did not move to greet her. He simply waited, the way a mountain waits for weather. She stepped down from the carriage with as much grace as her shaking knees allowed, and for one terrible moment, her heel caught the hem of her traveling dress and she stumbled. A gasp went through the line of servants. Eleanor caught herself against the carriage door, her face burning, and looked up to find the Duke watching her with an expression she could not read at all. Not amusement, not concern, nothing. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice low and even, "you have arrived." "I have," she said, because she could think of nothing else, and then, because silence frightened her more than foolishness, she added, "The road was very bumpy. I bit my tongue rather badly around the 3rd-mile marker, though I confess I could not read the marker itself, as we were going too fast to see the numbers." A pause. The housekeeper, a stout woman with kind eyes named Mrs. Bennet, made a small sound that might have been a cough or might have been a laugh, quickly swallowed. The Duke's face did not change. "I am sorry to hear it. Come inside. The wedding is in 2 hours, and I understand you will wish to rest before it." He did not offer his arm. He turned and walked back into the house, and Eleanor followed, feeling smaller than she had felt in years, though she was nearly a full head taller than most of her cousins. The interior of Ashcombe Hall was even grander than the outside had promised, all dark wood and tall windows and portraits of ancestors who seemed to judge her with painted eyes as she passed. Mrs. Bennet led her up a wide staircase to a room prepared for her, all soft blue and cream, with a window that looked out over gardens that had clearly once been beautiful and were now merely tidy, kept alive out of duty rather than love. "It's a fine room, miss," Mrs. Bennet said, closing the door behind them once Sally had gone to fetch water. The Duke had it prepared himself, chose the curtains and all. Eleanor turned, surprised. "He chose the curtains?" "He did." Mrs. Bennet's mouth twitched, as though she wanted to say more and had decided against it. "He is not an easy man, Miss Whitmore. I won't lie to you and say otherwise, but he is not a cruel one either. There's a difference, though I know it may not always feel like it." "Why does everyone speak of him as though he is a puzzle no one has solved?" Mrs. Bennet's smile faded slightly. "Because he is, miss. And because 7 years ago something happened in this house that none of us speak of, and the Duke least of all. I'll say no more than that. It is not my place." Eleanor wanted to ask more, wanted to pull at the thread until the whole story unraveled before her, but she had learned enough in her 22 years to know that some doors were shut for good reason, at least at first. She let the housekeeper leave her to rest, though rest was impossible. She sat by the window instead and watched clouds move over the gardens, and tried to imagine what kind of life waited for her behind a man's unmoving face. Her family had not sent her to Ashcombe Hall out of love. She understood that plainly, even if her mother pretended otherwise in every letter. The Whitmores had a good name and no money left to support it. The Duke needed a wife of respectable blood who would ask no questions and cause no scandal, and Eleanor, with her small dowry and her habit of speaking too honestly, had somehow been chosen above prettier, wealthier, more graceful girls. She suspected it was because she came cheap, in every sense of the word, and because the arrangement had been settled quickly by lawyers rather than by courtship. She did not resent it, exactly. She had always known her marriage would be a matter of business rather than affection. But she had hoped, in some quiet corner of her heart, that the man on the other end of the arrangement might at least be kind. Watching him from her window now, walking alone across the gravel path below with his hands still folded behind his back, she was not certain kindness was something he still possessed. The wedding itself was small, quiet, almost hurried. It took place in the family chapel attached to the house, with only a handful of witnesses, since the Duke's grandmother, Lady Constance, was too ill to travel far, and had insisted the ceremony happen at home, and soon, before her health failed further. Eleanor stood before the altar in a gown that had been altered twice to fit her properly, and the Duke stood beside her in the same dark gray he had worn to greet her, as though he owned no other color. When the vicar asked him to repeat his vows, his voice did not waver. When he asked Eleanor, her voice shook only slightly, and she was proud of herself for that. When the moment came to exchange rings, the Duke's hands were steady and cool as he placed the band on her finger, and his eyes met hers for one long second, and she saw something there she had not expected. Not warmth, not yet, but something like attention, as though for that 1 second he was truly looking at her, and not merely performing a duty he had rehearsed in his mind 100 times. Then it was over, and he released her hand, and the moment closed like a door. At the small wedding breakfast that followed, Lady Constance, propped up in a chair with blankets over her knees despite the mild weather, caught Eleanor's sleeve as she passed. "You are nervous," the old woman said, not unkindly. Her eyes were sharp despite her frail body, sharper than Eleanor expected. "Very much so, my lady." "Good. A woman who is not nervous on her wedding day has not understood what she is undertaking." Lady Constance's grip tightened slightly. "My grandson is not an easy man to love. I will not lie to you and pretend otherwise, as I am too old now to waste breath on pretty falsehoods. But he was not always as he is now. Something happened to him, and it broke something inside him that has never properly mended. I do not ask you to fix it. I only ask that you do not give up on him too quickly, as everyone else in his life has already done." Eleanor did not know what to say to that, so she said the truth, as she so often did without meaning to. "I do not know how to fix broken things, my lady. I only know how to be honest, sometimes too honest, and I am told that is not always welcome in a house like this one." Lady Constance laughed, a dry, surprised sound. "Then you may be exactly what this house needs, my dear. Honesty has been in short supply here for 7 long years." Across the room, the Duke stood near the window, a glass of wine untouched in his hand, watching his new wife speak with his grandmother, his expression as unreadable as ever. But for one moment, just before he turned away, Eleanor thought she saw his jaw tighten, as though something in the sight of the two of them together had struck a nerve he kept carefully hidden beneath all that stillness. She did not know, not yet, what waited for her in the rooms of Ashcombe Hall that no one spoke of. She did not know about the closed nursery on the 3rd floor, or the portrait turned to face the wall in the long gallery, or the name that had not been said aloud in this house in 7 years. She only knew that she had married a stranger, in a house full of secrets, and that somewhere beneath his silence, something in him had reacted to her honesty, in a way she could not yet explain. Before she retired, Sally helped her out of the wedding gown and into a plain nightdress, chattering all the while about the grandness of the house and the strangeness of the staff, who seemed, in her words, to move about like people trying not to wake a sleeping animal. "They're kind enough," Sally said, brushing out Eleanor's hair with careful strokes. "But there's a hush over this place, miss. Like everyone's waiting for something. I asked one of the younger maids about it, and she went pale and said I ought not to ask questions in this house. Imagine that." "Perhaps it is only because a new mistress has arrived," Eleanor said, though she did not quite believe her own words. "Change unsettles people, even good change." "Perhaps," Sally agreed, though she did not sound convinced either. When Sally had gone and the candles were low, Eleanor sat at the small writing desk by the window and began a letter to her mother. Though she managed only 2 lines before setting down the pen, she did not know what to say. She could hardly write that her husband had not smiled once, not during the vows, not during the small celebration after, not even when his own grandmother had teased him gently about his choice of bride. She could hardly write that she felt as though she had married a house full of shadows rather than a man. Instead, she rose and crossed to the window, drawing back the curtain her husband had chosen with his own hand, and that was when she saw it. A single light, burning steady in a window across the courtyard, in a part of the house Mrs. Bennet had not shown her that afternoon. She watched it for a long while, wondering who kept vigil there so late into the night, and on her wedding night of all nights. That night, alone in her new bedroom, Eleanor stood by the window and watched a single light burn in a room across the courtyard, in a wing of the house she had not yet been shown. It burned late into the night, long after the rest of the household had gone dark, and she wondered, before sleep finally took her, what kind of man sat awake alone on his own wedding night, staring at whatever ghosts kept him from resting. The teacup shattered against the floor before Eleanor even understood what her hand had done. It was her third morning at Ashcombe Hall, and the household had gathered for a small breakfast with two visiting neighbors, a Mr. and Mrs. Farrow who had come to inspect the new Duchess the way one inspects a horse before deciding whether to place a bet. Eleanor had been reaching across the table for the sugar when her sleeve caught the handle of her cup, and in an instant, the fine porcelain lay in pieces on the polished floor, tea spreading in a dark stain across the white tablecloth. Silence fell over the table like a dropped curtain. "Oh," Eleanor said, staring at the mess as though it had appeared by magic rather than her own clumsiness. "Oh, I am so terribly sorry. I have ruined the cloth, and the cup was surely very old. And I do apologize, truly. I did not mean to do it, though I suppose no one ever means to break things. That is rather the nature of accidents, isn't it?" "Eleanor." The Duke's voice cut through her rambling, not unkind, but firm. She stopped, her face burning, and looked up to find him watching her, his expression, as always, difficult to read. Mrs. Farrow was hiding a smile behind her napkin, and her husband looked simply bewildered, and a footman was already moving to clean the mess, but Eleanor felt as though the whole world had narrowed down to the Duke's gray eyes and whatever verdict they were about to deliver. "It is only a cup," the Duke said, and to her astonishment, there was no anger in his voice, only a strange, careful patience, as though he were choosing his words with great precision. "We have a dozen more like it. Mrs. Bennet will see to the cloth." "I am still sorry," Eleanor said, quieter now, and he gave a small nod, and that was the end of it, though Eleanor spent the rest of breakfast wishing she could disappear into the floor along with the broken porcelain. That was not the only mishap of her first week. On the second day, she had addressed the vicar's wife by the wrong name for the entire length of a visit, only to be gently corrected as the woman was leaving, at which point Eleanor had turned so red that Mrs. Bennet later told Sally she feared the young Duchess might actually catch fire. On the fourth day, she had misread the seating arrangement at dinner and sat herself in the chair reserved for the Duke's aunt, who arrived late and stood by the table with an expression of open astonishment while Eleanor scrambled to move, knocking her chair backward in the process. Each blunder felt like a stone added to a growing weight in her chest. She had grown up hearing that a lady's worth was measured by her grace, her poise, her ability to move through a room without ever drawing unwanted attention, and by every measure she had been taught, she was failing spectacularly in her new role. She began to dread mealtimes. She began to dread any gathering where more than 3 people were present. She began, most of all, to dread the moments when she caught the Duke watching her after some fresh embarrassment, certain she would find disappointment in his face, though strangely, she never quite did. What she found instead was something closer to puzzlement, as though she were a book written in a language he had not yet learned to read. On the 5th day, Eleanor sought refuge in Lady Constance's sitting room, where the old woman spent most afternoons wrapped in shawls despite the mild autumn weather, a stack of correspondence and a pot of chamomile tea always within reach. Eleanor had come to find these visits the one bright spot in her days, for Lady Constance never seemed shocked by anything she said, no matter how blunt or unpolished. "You look as though you have swallowed a wasp," Lady Constance observed, not looking up from her letters. "I insulted Lord Pemberton today," Eleanor admitted, sinking into the chair opposite, quite by accident. "I asked after his health, in a way that suggested I knew things about his condition that were meant to be kept private. He left in something of a hurry." To her surprise, Lady Constance laughed, a real, unguarded laugh that turned into a cough before it settled. "Lord Pemberton has been hiding his gout from society for a decade, convinced everyone believes his limp comes from a war wound he never actually suffered. I imagine it did him some good to be caught out, though I doubt he would agree. I did not mean to embarrass him." "No," Lady Constance said, setting down her letters and studying Eleanor with unexpected warmth. "But you meant to be honest, and in my experience, honesty embarrasses people far more often than cruelty does, because cruelty is at least expected, while honesty always catches a person by surprise. Do not apologize for it so readily, child. This house has had quite enough of polished lies." Eleanor turned that thought over carefully as she made her way back through the long corridors of the house afterward, past portraits of stern ancestors and windows fogged with the coming evening chill. She did not know what Lady Constance meant by polished lies, nor what had happened 7 years ago that everyone in the household seemed to circle around without ever naming. She only knew that the house held its breath around certain rooms, certain hours, certain names, and that she had not yet earned the right to ask why. It was on the 6th day, in the early evening, that everything began to shift, though so quietly that Eleanor almost missed it entirely. She had gone walking alone in the gardens after a particularly trying afternoon, during which she had, in an attempt at polite conversation with a visiting lord, asked a question about his health that had accidentally revealed she knew of a private illness he had hoped to keep quiet. The lord had left in a hurry, the duke had said nothing at all, and Eleanor had fled to the gardens the moment she could slip away unnoticed, tears of frustration burning behind her eyes. She found her way, without quite meaning to the stables at the edge of the property, drawn by the low, familiar sounds of horses shifting in their stalls. She had always found comfort among animals, who asked nothing of her and judged her for nothing, and she slipped inside without thinking of who might see her. There was a gray mare in the third stall, tall and elegant, with a white mark shaped like a crescent moon on her forehead. Eleanor approached slowly, murmuring nonsense the way she always had with the horses back home, telling the mare about her terrible day, about the broken cup and the ruined conversation, and the way she seemed to trail disaster behind her like a bridal train. "You would not judge me for it, would you?" she said softly, stroking the mare's nose. "You do not care whether I know the correct fork for fish or the proper way to address a viscount's wife. You only care whether I have brought you an apple, and I am afraid I have forgotten, though I promise to remember tomorrow." The mare nudged her hand, and Eleanor laughed, a real laugh, the first since her arrival at Ashcombe Hall. "That is a very serious conversation you are having." Eleanor spun around, her heart leaping into her throat, to find the Duke standing in the stable doorway, his coat dusted faintly with the evening's mist, watching her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It took her a moment to understand what it was, because it was so unfamiliar on him. It was something close to amusement. "Your Grace," she said, straightening quickly, embarrassment flooding back in. "I did not hear you approach. I was only, that is, I often speak to horses. I have done so since I was a child. My mother despaired of it. She said it was not a habit becoming of a lady, but I have never managed to break myself of it, and I do apologize if I have disturbed." "You have disturbed nothing," he said, stepping further into the stable, his boots quiet on the straw-covered floor. "I did not know you had a fondness for horses." "I have a fondness for anything that does not require me to remember which fork to use," Eleanor said, and then clapped a hand over her mouth, horrified at herself, certain she had just insulted every dinner she had eaten in his house. But the Duke did not frown. Instead, something flickered at the corner of his mouth, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, so fleeting that Eleanor might have imagined it entirely. He came to stand beside her at the mare's stall, close enough that she could smell rain and leather and something faintly like cedar. "Her name is Willow," he said, nodding toward the mare. "She was my mother's horse, before she left England. No one rides her now. I have not had the heart to sell her, though I am told it would be the sensible thing to do." "I am glad you have not sold her," Eleanor said, before she could stop herself. "She seems lonely. Horses do get lonely, you know, even if people forget that animals can feel such things." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, watching the mare rather than his wife. "You seem to understand loneliness rather well, for someone so young." Eleanor considered this carefully, unsure whether it was safe to answer honestly, and then decided, as she so often did, that honesty was the only thing she knew how to offer. "I have spent a great deal of my life being told I say the wrong things, Your Grace. It tends to leave a person somewhat isolated, even in a room full of company. I imagine you understand that better than most people I have met." She realized, the moment the words left her mouth, that she had gone too far, had stepped over some invisible line into territory she had no right to enter. She braced herself for coldness, for the wall to rise back up between them as it always did. But instead, the Duke turned to look at her fully, and for the first time since her arrival, he held her gaze without looking away. "Perhaps I do," he said quietly. Neither of them spoke again for a long while. They stood together in the dim stable, the mare shifting quietly beside them, the evening light fading gold and then gray through the high windows, and something unspoken passed between them, fragile as a held breath. It was Mrs. Bennet's voice calling across the yard that finally broke the moment, summoning them both to dinner, and the Duke stepped back at once, the familiar distance returning to his posture like a coat he had only briefly removed. "We should go in," he said. "Yes," Eleanor agreed, though some part of her wished to stay a little longer in the quiet of the stable, where she had not needed to worry about the correct fork or the proper greeting, where for a few minutes She had simply been herself, and it had, for once, seemed to be enough. As they walked back toward the house together, not touching but closer than they had walked before, Eleanor stole a glance at her husband's profile and wondered, with a small and unfamiliar flutter of hope, whether the man everyone described as unreachable might not be quite so unreachable after all. That night, she wrote a longer letter to her mother than she had managed before, though she still did not mention the light that burned across the courtyard, or the closed door on the third floor that Mrs. Bennet always steered her away from without explanation, or the strange, careful way the Duke sometimes looked at her, as though she reminded him of something he had lost. Some things she was beginning to understand could not yet be put into words. Some things had to be waited for, the way one waits for a locked door to finally be opened from the other side. At dinner that evening she noticed a small change she might have missed entirely had she not been paying such close attention. The Duke, usually silent through most of the meal, asked her a question about her childhood home, about whether she had always kept horses, about what her family's estate had looked like before it fell into difficulty. She answered carefully at first, waiting for the familiar wall to rise between them again, but it did not come. He listened. He asked a second question, and then a third, and for the length of one meal, the great cold dining hall of Ashcombe Hall felt, for the first time since her arrival, almost like a home rather than a stage on which she was expected to perform. Later, as Sally helped her prepare for bed, the maid could not stop remarking on it. "The whole staff noticed, miss, I promise you that. Mrs. Bennet nearly dropped the gravy boat when His Grace asked you a second question. He hasn't asked anyone a second question at dinner in all the years I've been here." Perhaps he was only being polite, Eleanor said, though she did not quite believe it herself, and she found, as she lay in bed that night with the same distant light burning across the courtyard, that some small and cautious hope had begun to take root in her chest, fragile as new growth after a long frost, and she was almost afraid to let herself trust it. The door had been locked for 7 years, and Eleanor found the key entirely by accident. She had been searching for a missing glove in the linen room on the 3rd floor, a part of the house she rarely visited, when her fingers brushed a small brass key hidden behind a stack of folded sheets, tied with a faded ribbon that had once been blue. Something about the way it had been hidden, tucked away rather than simply misplaced, made her pause. She turned it over in her palm, and curiosity, which had gotten her into more trouble in her life than almost any other quality, pulled her down the corridor, toward the one door in Ashcombe Hall that every servant seemed to walk past without ever looking at directly. It was a plain door, unremarkable except for the layer of dust along its frame, the kind of dust that spoke of years rather than days. Eleanor stood before it for a long moment, key in hand, some instinct warning her that whatever lay beyond it was not hers to open. But her hand moved anyway, and the key turned with a soft click, and the door swung inward on hinges that had not been oiled in a very long time. It was a nursery. Sunlight, thin and gray through curtains no one had opened in years, fell across a room frozen in time. A small bed sat against one wall, its coverlet still neatly tucked, as though waiting for a child who would never return to sleep in it. A rocking horse stood in the corner, its paint faded, but its shape still proud, still ready to be ridden. Toy soldiers stood in careful formation on a shelf, arranged by a hand that had clearly loved order, and a child's drawings, curling at the edges with age, were pinned along one wall, showing horses and ships and a boy's idea of dragons. Eleanor stepped inside slowly, her heart aching in a way she did not fully understand, and it was only when she reached the small writing desk in the corner, its surface covered in a fine layer of dust, that she saw the name carved crudely into the wood, the work of a child's careless knife. Henry Ashcombe. She understood, all at once, whose room this had been, and why the entire household moved around it like a held breath. "You should not be in here." Eleanor turned so quickly she nearly knocked over the rocking horse. The Duke stood in the doorway, and for the first time since her arrival, his face was not unreadable at all. It was raw, open, stricken, the careful mask he wore every day cracked entirely away, and beneath it, Eleanor saw something that frightened her more than his coldness ever had. She saw grief, old and unhealed, worn thin by 7 years of being carried alone. "I am so sorry," she said at once, moving toward the door. "I found the key by accident. I did not mean to intrude. I will leave immediately. I should never have." "Stay." The word came out rough, almost against his will, and Eleanor stopped where she stood, uncertain, watching as he crossed the room slowly, his eyes moving over every object as though seeing them for the first time in years rather than the 100th. He stopped before the small writing desk, his fingers hovering over the carved name without quite touching it. He was 11 years old, the Duke said quietly, as though the words had been waiting a long time to be spoken. My brother, Henry. He drowned in the lake at the far edge of the property, in winter, when the ice looked thick enough to bear his weight and was not. Eleanor's hand rose to her mouth. Your Grace, I am so terribly sorry. I was supposed to be watching him. His voice did not rise, did not break, but there was something underneath it, something that had been buried so deep and for so long that it seemed to come from a great distance. Our father had asked me to keep him from the lake that day. I was 17. I had better things to do than watch an 11-year-old boy who idolized me and followed me everywhere I went, and so I let him wander off while I sat with a book beneath a tree, thinking I would look up in a moment, thinking there would always be another moment. That was not your fault, Eleanor said softly, though she understood, even as she said it, that the words would not reach him, that they had likely been said to him many times before by many people, and had never once made a difference. Everyone tells me that, the Duke said, and there was something almost bitter in it now, though not directed at her. My father never said it. My father looked at me differently for the rest of his life, right up until the day he died, and I do not blame him for it. I have looked at myself the same way every day since. I closed this room the week after the funeral, and I have not been inside it since, not once, in 7 years. Then why come in now? He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his expression made Eleanor's breath catch. Because you were in here, and some part of me could not bear the thought of you finding this alone, discovering it the way the servants whisper about it, in fragments and half-truths. If you were going to know, I wanted you to know it properly, from me. Eleanor did not know what to say to that, so for once, she said nothing at all, and simply stood beside him in the dusty gray light, letting the silence hold what words could not. After a long while, the Duke reached out and touched the rocking horse, setting it gently rocking with the barest push of his fingers, and something in his face softened, just slightly, at the small motion. He loved this thing well past the age when he should have outgrown it, he said, and there was, for the first time, a faint warmth in his voice, rather than only grief. He used to insist I ride it with him, though I was far too large for it, and we would both end up in a heap on the floor, laughing until our father came to see what all the noise was about. He sounds as though he brought a great deal of joy into this house. He did. The Duke's jaw tightened, and for a moment Eleanor feared she had said the wrong thing again, but then he continued, quietly, This house has felt very quiet since he left it. I had not realized how quiet until recently. Eleanor understood, without needing him to say it plainly, that he meant since her arrival, and something warm and fragile bloomed in her chest at the thought, though she was careful not to let it show too openly on her face. They stood together in the nursery a while longer, and slowly, hesitantly, the Duke began to point out small things around the room. A chipped soldier that Henry had dropped down the stairs once and refused to have repaired because he liked the story of how it happened. A drawing of a dragon that was meant to be a horse but had gone terribly wrong. A small stain on the rug where a bottle of ink had been spilled during a lesson Henry had found unbearably dull. Each small memory seemed to cost him something to share, and yet he kept sharing them, as though a door long sealed inside him had been forced open alongside the one on its hinges, and could not now be closed again quite so easily. When they finally left the room, the Duke did not lock the door behind them. Leave it open, he said, when Eleanor moved to return the key. I think it has been closed long enough. Over the following days, something in the house began, very slowly, to change. The Duke did not become a different man overnight, and Eleanor did not expect him to. He still spent long hours alone in his study, still carried himself with the same careful reserve in company, still rarely smiled where others could see. But small things shifted between them, in private moments that belonged only to the two of them. He began seeking her out in the evenings, not always to speak, but simply to sit near her while she read or embroidered badly, content, it seemed, with her presence alone. He asked, one afternoon, if she might like to see the gardens his mother had once tended before she left England, and Eleanor discovered a walled section of the property that had been neglected for years, roses gone wild and paths overgrown with weeds, and something in her ached to see it restored. Might I try? She asked. I am not skilled with a needle or a dance step, Your Grace, but I have always had a way with growing things. My aunt used to say I could coax a rose to bloom out of pure stubbornness. The Duke considered the tangled garden for a long moment, and something crossed his face that Eleanor was beginning to recognize as the shadow of an old memory, gentler this time than the grief of the nursery. My mother loved this garden more than any other place on the estate, he said. She planted half of it herself, before she left. I have not had the heart to look at it properly since. Then perhaps it is time someone did, Eleanor said gently. Not to erase what it once was, Your Grace, only to let it live again. He did not answer for a long moment, and Eleanor feared she had overstepped, as she so often did. But then he nodded, once, and something in his shoulders eased, as though a weight he had carried a long time had shifted, if only slightly, to make room for someone else to help carry it. Then it is yours, he said. Do with it as you see fit. The next morning, Eleanor rose before the household and made her way to the walled garden with an old apron borrowed from the kitchen, and a pair of shears she had found in the gardener's shed. She had not expected company, and so she was startled, an hour into her work, to hear footsteps on the gravel path behind her, and turned to find the Duke watching her from beneath the archway, still in his riding coat, as though he had come from the stables rather than from breakfast. You are working alone, he observed, and there was something in his tone that suggested this displeased him, though not in the way displeasure usually showed on his face. I did not think anyone would wish to join me in pulling weeds, Your Grace. It is not a task that suits fine coats. No, he agreed, and to her astonishment, he began removing his coat, folding it carefully over a nearby bench, but I find I am not in the mood for a fine coat this morning. He knelt beside her without further explanation and began, somewhat clumsily, to clear away the tangled vines from around an old rose bush, and Eleanor had to bite back a laugh at the sight of the Duke of Ashcombe with dirt on his hands and a look of fierce concentration on his face, as though weeding were a battle he intended to win through sheer determination alone. You are doing it wrong, she said finally, unable to help herself. You will kill the bush if you pull at it like that. You must clear around the base first, gently, or you will tear the roots along with the weeds. I confess I know nothing of gardens, he admitted, sitting back on his heels. My mother tried to teach me once, when I was young, but I found it tedious and much preferred my books. And now? He glanced at the rose bush, and then at her, and something in his expression made Eleanor's chest tighten pleasantly. Now I find I do not mind it so much, in the right company. They worked together for the better part of an hour, Eleanor guiding his clumsy but earnest efforts, both of them gradually losing the careful formality that usually governed their conversations. He told her, hesitantly at first and then more freely, about his mother, about how she had left for the continent 2 years after Henry's death, unable to bear the grief of the house any longer, and how he had not seen her since, though they exchanged occasional letters that grew shorter and more distant with each passing year. Eleanor listened without judgment, only offering quiet questions here and there, and found that the Duke seemed to speak more easily when his hands were occupied with something other than the stillness he usually held himself to. You have a gift for this, he said at one point, watching her clear a tangle of ivy from around an old stone bench with quick, sure movements, not merely the gardening, the listening. You do not flinch from difficult things the way most people do. I have simply never learned to pretend difficult things are not there, Eleanor said. My mother despaired of it. She said no gentleman would want a wife who spoke so plainly of things better left unsaid. Your mother was wrong, the Duke said, quietly enough that Eleanor almost missed it, and she felt her face grow warm and turned quickly back to her work so he would not see it. By midday, they had cleared only a small section of the garden, far less than Eleanor had hoped to manage alone, but it felt, somehow, like a far greater accomplishment than she had expected. As they walked back toward the house for the midday meal, her apron stained with soil and his hands roughened from unfamiliar labor, Mrs. Bennet met them at the door with an expression of open astonishment that she quickly tried and failed to hide. Well, the housekeeper said, looking between the two of them, I don't believe I've seen His Grace with dirt under his fingernails since he was a boy. Do not sound so surprised, Mrs. Bennet, the Duke said, and though his voice remained even, Eleanor caught the faint curve at the corner of his mouth, gone again almost before she could be certain she had seen it at all. A man is permitted to change his habits now and then. Of course, Your Grace, Mrs. Bennet said, though her eyes, when they met Eleanor's, held something warm and knowing that made Eleanor's heart lift in a way she had not expected. It was a small thing, a garden and an open door and a handful of shared memories, but Eleanor understood, walking back toward the house beside her husband as the evening light turned gold across the grounds, that something had shifted between them that could not easily be undone. The ice was not gone. She did not imagine it would melt all at once, after only a few days and a few honest conversations, but for the first time since her arrival at Ashcombe Hall, she believed, with a small and stubborn hope, that it might melt eventually, given enough patience, and enough honesty, and enough time spent simply standing beside him in the quiet. That evening, before retiring, Eleanor found a small folded note left on her writing desk. In handwriting she did not yet recognize but would come to know very well in the months ahead. It contained only a few words, simple and unadorned, but she read them 3 times before she finally set the note aside and blew out her candle. Thank you for opening the door. I did not know how much I needed someone to walk through it with me. She fell asleep that night with the note still resting on the table beside her bed, and for the first time since her arrival, the distant light across the courtyard did not burn quite so late into the night. Whatever ghosts had kept the Duke awake on his wedding night seemed, if only for a few hours, to have loosened their grip, and Eleanor allowed herself to hope that she had played some small part in setting them free. The invitation arrived on cream paper with a gold seal, and Eleanor knew, the moment she read the name at the bottom of it, that trouble had found its way to Ashcombe Hall. Lady Margaret Vale was hosting a ball, the first grand society event since Eleanor's wedding, and everyone who mattered in the county had been invited, which meant, in practice, everyone who might enjoy watching the Duke's awkward new Duchess embarrass herself in front of a room full of witnesses. Eleanor had heard whispers about Lady Margaret in the weeks since her arrival, whispers that suggested the woman had once hoped to become the Duchess of Ashcombe herself, before the Duke's grandmother had settled matters quickly and quietly with the Whitmore family instead. You need not go if you would rather not, the Duke said, watching her read the invitation across the breakfast table, his voice careful in a way that told her he understood exactly what kind of evening awaited them both. I am your wife, Eleanor said, setting the letter down with more confidence than she felt. I will not hide from a ball because I am afraid of one woman's opinion of me, however sharp her tongue is said to be. The Duke studied her for a long moment, and something like pride flickered across his face, quick and unfamiliar. Very well, we will go together. The days leading up to the ball passed in a blur of fittings and rehearsed conversation, Eleanor practicing her curtsy and her dance steps, with a determination that left her feet aching by evening. She had grown in the weeks since her arrival, more comfortable in the quiet corners of Ashcombe Hall, in the garden and the stables and the once-locked nursery that now stood open to the afternoon light. But a ballroom full of strangers eager to find fault with her was a different matter entirely, and she could not shake the feeling that she was walking toward a trap she could see clearly and still could not avoid. On the afternoon of the ball, Eleanor visited Lady Constance in her sitting room, seeking, though she would not have admitted it aloud, some measure of courage before the evening ahead. She found the old woman in unusually good spirits, a rare flush of color in her cheeks, a stack of old letters spread across her lap. Lady Margaret Vale, Lady Constance said, when Eleanor mentioned the name of their hostess, and something sharp glinted in her eyes. That woman spent 3 years angling to become the next Duchess of Ashcombe, and she has never quite forgiven me for choosing otherwise. You must not let her see that her words have any power over you, my dear. Women like Lady Margaret feed on visible pain the way plants feed on sunlight. Deny her the light, and she will wither soon enough. I am not certain I know how to appear unaffected, my lady. I have never been particularly skilled at hiding what I feel. Lady Constance reached out and took Eleanor's hand in her own frail, papery one, her grip surprisingly firm. Then do not hide it. Let her see exactly how unaffected you truly are, because you have already won the only contest that matters. You have my grandson's attention, and more than that, I begin to suspect you have his heart, though he is likely too stubborn to admit it even to himself. No amount of clever cruelty from a jealous woman can undo that. Eleanor left the sitting room with Lady Constance's words settled warm in her chest, and though her nerves did not entirely vanish, she found she could carry them a little more lightly than before. She returned to her rooms to find Sally already laying out gowns across the bed, muttering to herself about ribbons and hairpins with the fierce concentration of a general planning a campaign. We shall have you looking finer than any woman in that ballroom, miss, mark my words, Sally declared, holding up a length of deep blue silk against the fading afternoon light. Let Lady Margaret Vale say what she likes. She has never once managed to make His Grace smile, and I hear tell that is rather more than she can claim after tonight, if what the kitchen maids are whispering proves true. What are they whispering? Sally's grin turned mischievous. Only that His Grace has been humming to himself in the hallways this past week, miss. Humming. Mrs. Bennet nearly fainted the first time she heard it. None of us have heard the man make a musical sound since before the young master passed. God rest him. Eleanor felt a flush of warmth spread through her at the thought, quickly followed by a fresh wave of nerves at what the evening ahead might hold. She sat still and let Sally work, pins and combs moving deftly through her hair, until at last the maid stepped back with evident satisfaction. There, Sally said, now let us see what Lady Margaret Vale makes of that. The night of the ball, Eleanor dressed in deep blue silk that Mrs. Bennet had helped select, her hair arranged more elegantly than she had ever managed on her own. When she descended the staircase to meet the Duke, he was waiting at the bottom, and for one long moment, he simply looked at her without speaking, an expression on his face that made her breath catch. "You look remarkable," he said finally, offering his arm. "I look terrified," Eleanor admitted, taking it. Perhaps both things can be true at once. Lady Margaret Vale's estate glittered with candlelight when they arrived, every window ablaze, music already spilling out into the cool evening air. Eleanor felt every eye in the ballroom turn toward them as they entered, felt the whispers ripple outward like water disturbed by a stone, and she gripped the Duke's arm a little tighter, grateful for its steadiness beneath her fingers. Lady Margaret herself met them near the entrance, resplendent in crimson, her smile sharp as a blade beneath its polish. "Your Grace," she said, curtsying to the Duke with a warmth that did not extend to the woman beside him, "and the new Duchess. How very brave of you to venture out into society so soon. I do hope the evening will not prove too overwhelming." "I have faced worse than a ballroom, Lady Margaret," Eleanor said, keeping her voice steady, and something flickered across Lady Margaret's face, brief and unreadable, before her smile widened further. The evening proceeded well enough at first. Eleanor danced with the Duke, and though her steps were not perfectly practiced, she did not stumble, and for a little while she allowed herself to relax into the music and the warmth of his hand at her waist. But Lady Margaret had not invited her merely to watch her succeed. It happened during the third hour of the ball, as the guests gathered for refreshments between dances. Lady Margaret raised her voice just enough to be heard by the surrounding circle, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "I do think it is admirable, truly, how the Duke has managed to overlook so much for the sake of family duty. A bride with no dowry, no particular grace, no real accomplishments to speak of beyond, I am told, an unusual fondness for horses. One wonders what the great houses of England are coming to, when a duke must settle for so little." The words landed like a slap across the crowded room, and Eleanor felt her face go hot, felt every eye turn toward her once more, this time not merely curious but hungry, waiting to see how she would break beneath the weight of public humiliation. She opened her mouth, uncertain what she meant to say, uncertain if any words would come at all. It was the Duke who spoke first. His voice, when it came, was quiet, but it carried across the room with a force that silenced every conversation within earshot. "Lady Margaret, I have known you since we were children, and I have always found you clever, though rarely wise. Allow me to correct your understanding of my wife, since it appears to be sorely lacking." A ripple of astonishment moved through the crowd. Eleanor stared up at him, stunned, as he continued, his eyes never leaving Lady Margaret's face. "My wife has more genuine kindness in her smallest finger than most of the people in this room possess in their entire bodies. She has restored a garden my mother loved and abandoned, without being asked. She has opened a room in my house that had been sealed for 7 years, not through prying, but through a gentleness I did not know I still needed. She speaks honestly, which I understand some in this room find distasteful, likely because honesty is in such short supply among them. I did not settle for her, Lady Margaret. I consider myself fortunate beyond what I deserve." The silence that followed was absolute. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, though whether from shock or something warmer, she could not entirely say. Lady Margaret's composure cracked, just slightly, color rising in her cheeks, and she offered a stiff, shallow curtsy before retreating into the crowd without another word. The Duke turned to Eleanor, and for the first time since she had known him, in front of an entire ballroom of watching eyes, the corner of his mouth lifted into something that was, unmistakably, undeniably, a smile. "Would you care to dance again?" he asked, extending his hand. Eleanor took it, her own hand trembling slightly, and let him lead her back onto the floor, the music swelling around them as though the evening itself had been waiting for this exact moment. Around the edges of the room she caught snatches of whispered conversation, no longer mocking but curious, even admiring, and she understood, with a small thrill of disbelief, that the tide of the evening had turned entirely in their favor. "You did not need to defend me so fiercely," she said quietly, as they moved together through the steps. "Though I confess I am very glad you did. I have spent 7 years saying very little to very many people," the Duke said, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. "I find, rather to my own surprise, that I no longer wish to stay silent when it matters most." "And does it matter, what people think of me?" He was quiet for a moment, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "It matters what they think of you because I find that I can no longer bear to hear you spoken of unkindly." I am not certain when that changed, Eleanor, but I know that it has. It was the first time he had used her given name, without the formal address that had always separated them, and the sound of it in his voice sent a warmth through her chest that had nothing to do with the crowded, overheated ballroom. They did not speak of it further that night, but as their carriage carried them home beneath a sky scattered with stars, Eleanor rested her head lightly against the Duke's shoulder, and he did not pull away. Instead, after a long moment, she felt his hand cover hers where it rested on the seat between them, his fingers warm and certain, and neither of them spoke again for the rest of the journey, though the silence between them now felt entirely different from the silence that had greeted her on her first day at Ashcombe Hall. It felt, for the first time, like the comfortable quiet shared between two people who had finally begun, however cautiously, to trust one another. When the carriage finally rolled through the gates of Ashcombe Hall, most of the household had long since gone to bed, but Mrs. Bennet waited up regardless, claiming she could never quite settle until she knew the master and mistress had returned safely. She took one look at the pair of them descending from the carriage, hands still loosely joined, and a knowing smile spread across her broad face. "A pleasant evening, I take it, Your Grace?" "A very pleasant evening, Mrs. Bennet," the Duke replied, and though his voice remained composed, there was a lightness in it that the housekeeper clearly noticed, for her eyes grew suspiciously bright as she curtsied and bid them both good night. Eleanor climbed the stairs slowly, exhaustion and elation warring pleasantly within her, and paused at the top where the corridor split, one way leading to her chambers, the other to his. The Duke paused beside her, seeming reluctant, for the first time since her arrival, to simply walk away into the silence of his own rooms. "Thank you," Eleanor said softly, "for what you said tonight. I do not think anyone has ever defended me so completely in my entire life." "Then everyone in your life before me was a fool," he said simply, and reached out to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear with a gentleness that made her breath catch in her throat. "Good night, Eleanor." "Good night, Julian," she said, using his given name for the first time, and watched something warm and startled flicker across his face before he inclined his head and turned toward his own chambers. Alone in her room, Eleanor sat by the window a long while, watching the courtyard below, and for the first time since her arrival at Ashcombe Hall, no light burned across the way in that distant, sleepless room. Whatever had kept the Duke awake so many nights seemed, for once, to have finally allowed him some peace, and Eleanor drifted off to sleep with a small, hopeful smile on her own face, wondering what the coming days might bring now that the coldest walls between them had finally begun, unmistakably, to fall. Rain hammered against the windows of Ashcombe Hall the night everything finally broke open between them. It had been 3 weeks since the ball at Lady Margaret Vale's estate, 3 weeks of small, cautious steps towards something neither Eleanor nor the Duke had yet named aloud. He sought her out more often now, in the garden in the mornings, in the library in the evenings, his reserve softening a little more each day, though something still held him back from crossing whatever final threshold remained between them. Eleanor had begun to suspect it was fear rather than indifference, though she did not yet understand what, exactly, he was afraid of. Earlier that same day, before the clouds had gathered on the horizon, Eleanor had spent the morning in the walled garden with the Duke beside her, the two of them now finding excuses nearly every day to work there together. The roses had begun to bloom again under her care, and the Duke had taken, without quite admitting it aloud, to bringing her tea in the mornings and staying to drink his own beside her while she worked. "You have transformed this place," he said that morning, surveying the garden with something close to wonder. "I hardly recognize it from the tangled ruin it was when you first asked to try your hand at it." "Gardens are patient things," Eleanor said, brushing soil from her hands. "They do not ask to be transformed quickly. They only ask for steady care, given consistently, over time. I find people are rather similar in that regard, though society seems to have forgotten it." The Duke had looked at her then with an expression she was beginning to recognize, something between admiration and a kind of quiet astonishment, as though he still could not quite believe his fortune in finding her. He said nothing more on the matter, but he had reached for her hand as they walked back toward the house, and Eleanor had felt, in the warmth of his fingers around hers, a promise of something neither of them had yet spoken aloud. She had not expected that promise to be tested so soon, nor so severely, when the storm rolled in that evening with a violence that seemed to reach into the very foundations of the house. The storm arrived without warning during dinner, thunder rolling low across the grounds, rain lashing the tall windows of the dining hall with a violence that made the candles flicker despite the thick glass protecting them. Eleanor noticed the change in the Duke almost at once. His shoulders tensed, his hand holding his wine glass went suddenly still. By the time the second crack of thunder split the sky, His face had gone pale in a way she had never seen before, not even in the nursery. "Julian?" she said softly, using his given name, which she had grown gradually more comfortable doing since the night of the ball. "Are you unwell?" "I am fine," he said, though his voice was tight, and he set down his glass with more care than the gesture required, as though his hands could not quite be trusted otherwise. They finished the meal in silence, the storm growing steadily worse outside, and when Eleanor rose to retire for the evening, she found herself reluctant to leave him alone in his current state. She hesitated at the door of the dining hall, watching him remain seated at the long table, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular, his knuckles white where his hands rested against the wood. "Would you walk with me?" she asked. "I find storms rather difficult to sleep through, and I would welcome the company." It was not entirely true. Eleanor had never minded storms, but something in her instinct told her that the Duke needed a reason to move, to speak, to be drawn out of whatever memory the thunder had dragged him back into, and she was willing to offer a small untruth if it served that purpose. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his eyes told her he understood exactly what she was doing, and was grateful for it regardless. Of course. They walked together through the quiet corridors of the house, past darkened portraits and cold hearths, until they reached the long gallery on the second floor, where tall windows looked out over the storm-lashed grounds. Lightning split the sky as they walked, illuminating the gardens below in brief silver flashes, and with each flash, Eleanor noticed the Duke flinch, ever so slightly, a reaction he could not quite master no matter how he tried to hide it. "It was raining," he said suddenly, stopping before one of the tall windows, his voice barely above a whisper. "The night Henry died. Not this hard, not a storm like this, but rain all the same, and the ice on the lake had looked solid enough in the gray afternoon light. I did not think about the rain until much later. I did not think about how it might have weakened the ice further, how the sound of it might have covered whatever sounds he made when he went under, how I might have heard him if only the world had been quieter that day." Eleanor stood very still, understanding now why storms unsettled him so deeply, understanding a piece of his grief she had not yet reached even in the nursery weeks before. "I searched for 2 hours before I found the hole in the ice," he continued, his voice growing rougher with each word, as though something long buried was finally forcing its way to the surface. 2 hours, Eleanor, while my brother was already gone, and I did not know it, and I kept searching and calling his name into the rain like a fool, as though shouting loudly enough might undo what had already happened. When they finally pulled him from the water, I was the one who had to carry him back to the house. I was the one who had to walk through that door and tell my father that his younger son, his favorite, the boy everyone in this house adored, was gone, because his older brother had been too absorbed in a book to watch him properly. "Julian," Eleanor said gently, reaching for his hand. "I have never told anyone the whole of it," he said, his voice breaking slightly for the first time since she had known him. "Not my father, who died still looking at me as though I had taken something from him he could never forgive. Not my mother, who left for the continent because she could not bear to look at the son who lived when the son she adored had not. I have carried it alone for 7 years, Eleanor, and I do not know how to set it down." Eleanor stepped closer, both her hands now wrapped around his, and looked up into his face, lit only by the flickering lightning outside the tall windows. "You do not have to set it down alone anymore," she said quietly. "That is what I am here for, Julian, if you will let me carry some small part of it alongside you. I cannot undo what happened to Henry. No one can. But you do not have to carry the weight of it in silence for the rest of your life, punishing yourself for a tragedy that was never truly your fault." "How can you be so certain it was not my fault?" "Because you were 17, Eleanor said firmly, "and children die in accidents every day in this world, in ways no one could have predicted or prevented, no matter how carefully they were watched. You have spent 7 years believing that if you had simply looked up from your book a moment sooner, everything would be different. But grief does not work by fair math, Julian. It does not weigh guilt against love and arrive at a just verdict. It simply is, and it will keep being, until you allow yourself to grieve without also punishing yourself for surviving." He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching hers in the dim light, and Eleanor could see something shifting behind them, some old and rigid structure finally beginning to crack under the weight of being spoken aloud after so many years of silence. "I do not know how to stop," he admitted finally, his voice raw. "I have punished myself for so long that I am not certain who I would be without it." "Then let me help you find out," Eleanor said softly, slowly, "if that is what it takes. I am not asking you to forget your brother Julian, or to stop grieving him. I am only asking you to let yourself live alongside that grief, rather than being buried beneath it forever. Something in his face broke open then, not in sorrow but in something closer to relief, as though a burden he had carried so long he had forgotten its actual weight had finally been set down, even if only for a moment. He reached up, his hand trembling slightly, and cupped her face gently in his palm, his thumb brushing softly across her cheek. "When did you become so essential to me?" he asked quietly, more to himself than to her. "I did not expect this. I did not expect any of this, when my grandmother first proposed the match. I expected a convenient arrangement, a quiet house, an unremarkable wife who would ask nothing of me and demand nothing in return. Instead, I find myself entirely undone by a woman who speaks too honestly and loves too openly, and has somehow managed to make me feel things I believed had died along with my brother 7 years ago." "I did not set out to undo you," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper, her heart racing beneath her ribs. "No," he agreed, "but you have, regardless, and I find that I am glad of it, however frightening it is to admit." He leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away if she wished, and when she did not, when instead she rose slightly onto her toes to close the remaining distance between them, their lips met in a kiss that held all the careful weeks of restraint that had come before it, gentle at first, and then deepening as his arms came around her, drawing her close against him, as though he could not bear even the smallest distance between them any longer. When they finally parted, both of them slightly breathless, the storm outside had begun to ease, thunder rolling further into the distance, rain softening against the windows into a gentler rhythm. "I love you," the Duke said, the words seeming to surprise him even as he spoke them, as though he had not planned to say them so soon, or perhaps at all, but found he could no longer hold them back. "I did not expect to. I did not think myself capable of it any longer, after everything. But I love you, Eleanor, entirely and without reservation. And I do not know how I managed to survive this house for 7 years before you arrived, to fill it with warmth again." Eleanor felt tears rise unbidden to her eyes, and she did not try to hide them, because there was no room left between them now for the polite pretenses that had once ruled her every word and gesture. "I love you as well, Julian. I did not expect it either. I came here believing I would spend my life married to a stranger, and instead I find I have fallen in love with the kindest, most wounded, most quietly remarkable man I have ever known." They stood together at the tall window a long while, his arms still loosely around her, her head resting against his chest where she could hear the steady beat of his heart, slower now than it had been, calmer, as though speaking his grief aloud had eased something deep within him that no amount of quiet suffering ever could have. "Tell me about him," Eleanor said softly, after a while. "Not the day he died. Tell me about who he was, when he was simply your brother, before any of this happened." The Duke was quiet for a moment, and Eleanor feared she had asked too much, too soon, but then he began to speak, and this time his voice held none of the roughness of before, only a kind of tender warmth she had not yet heard from him. "He was impossible," he said, and there was real affection in it now. "He followed me everywhere, asked 1,000 questions a day, most of them about things no reasonable person would ever wonder about, like whether fish became thirsty, or why the moon did not simply fall out of the sky. He wanted to be exactly like me in every way, which I found unbearably tedious as an older brother, though I would give a great deal now to have him following me through these halls again, asking his endless foolish questions." Eleanor laughed softly, the sound gentle in the quiet room, and felt the Duke's arms tighten slightly around her, as though grateful for the lightness she had brought to a memory that had for so long carried only pain. "He would have liked you," the Duke continued. "He adored anyone who spoke to him honestly, rather than simply humoring him the way most adults did. I think the two of you would have gotten along splendidly, and argued constantly, and I believe he would have loved every moment of it." "I wish I could have known him," Eleanor said. "So do I," the Duke murmured, pressing a soft kiss to the top of her head. "But I find that speaking of him with you, rather than avoiding his memory entirely, makes the grief feel less like a wound, and more like something I can finally begin to carry properly, the way it was always meant to be carried, rather than hidden away behind locked doors." They talked a while longer, of small things and large ones, of Henry's love of dragons that looked suspiciously like horses, of the mother who had left and the father who had never quite forgiven, of Eleanor's own childhood and the horses she had loved, and the mother who had despaired of her honesty. And slowly, gradually, the space between them, which had once felt as vast and unreachable as the distance between strangers, closed entirely, until there was nothing left but two people who had finally, after so much careful waiting, allowed themselves to be fully known by one another. It was very late when they finally retired. The storm long since passed. The house settled into a peaceful silence, unlike any Eleanor had felt there before. At her door, the Duke paused, cupping her face gently once more in his hands. "Good night, my love," he said, the endearment slipping out easily now, as though it had always belonged there. "Good night, Julian," she answered, and watched him walk toward his own chambers with a lightness in his step she had never seen before. And for the first time in 7 years, when the household staff rose early the next morning to begin their duties, they found the Duke already awake in the breakfast room, sunlight falling across his face through the tall windows, and on his lips, unmistakable and entirely unguarded, a smile. Mrs. Bennet, upon seeing it, had to excuse herself from the room entirely, overcome by an emotion she would later describe to Sally as something between joy and disbelief, and word of the Duke's smile spread through the household by mid-morning, with the speed and reverence usually reserved for news of far greater importance, because in this house, after 7 long years of silence and grief, a single smile was the greatest miracle any of them could have hoped to witness. Even Lady Constance, when she heard the news from her own maid over her morning tea, set down her cup with unusual care, and allowed herself a long, satisfied smile of her own. "Well," she said quietly, to no one in particular, "it took long enough." By the time Eleanor came down to breakfast that morning, still faintly flushed with the memory of the night before, she found the Duke waiting for her, and when their eyes met across the room, he did not look away, nor did his expression settle back into its familiar, careful stillness. He simply smiled again, warm and unguarded, and rose to pull out her chair himself rather than waiting for a footman to do it, a small gesture that meant, to everyone watching, far more than words ever could have conveyed. Whatever walls had once stood between the Duke of Ashcombe and the rest of the world had not vanished entirely, not in a single night, but they had, at last, begun to come down, stone by careful stone, and Eleanor understood that she would spend the rest of her days helping him clear away whatever remained. The letter arrived without a name attached, and Eleanor knew at once that it had been written by someone who wanted to destroy her without ever being caught in the act. It came 3 weeks after the storm that had changed everything between her and the Duke, 3 weeks of quiet happiness that Eleanor had begun, foolishly perhaps, to believe might continue undisturbed. The household had settled into a new rhythm, warmer and easier than before, the Duke's laughter no longer a rare and startling thing, but something Eleanor heard nearly every day, in the garden, at dinner, in the quiet hours they now spent together in his study, rather than apart in separate rooms. The letter found her at breakfast, delivered among the ordinary post, and Eleanor nearly set it aside unopened before something in the plain, unmarked envelope made her curious enough to slit it open instead. The words inside were cruel and precise, clearly written by someone who had taken great care in choosing exactly how much damage they might do. It claimed that Eleanor's family had concealed a scandal from years before, a supposed indiscretion involving her late father and a matter of unpaid debts settled only through dishonest means, and it suggested, in careful, poisonous language, that the Duke had been deceived into marrying a woman whose family's reputation was built on lies. Eleanor read the letter twice, her hands trembling, before she understood 2 things at once. First, that parts of it, twisted though they were, contained fragments of truth, since her father had indeed struggled with debts in his final years, though nothing so dishonest as the letter implied. Second, and more troublingly, that whoever had written it clearly wished for it to reach beyond her own hands. For a second copy, the letter noted almost as an afterthought, had already been sent to several prominent members of society, including, the writer noted with evident satisfaction, Lady Margaret Vale. She found the Duke in his study within the hour, the letter clutched tightly in her hand, and though her instinct was to hide it from him entirely, to protect him from whatever scandal might follow, she had promised herself weeks ago in the long gallery that she would never again let silence stand between them where honesty could serve instead. "I received something troubling this morning," she said, setting the letter on his desk before her courage could fail her. "I think you should read it." The Duke read it slowly, his expression growing darker with each line, and when he finished, he set it down with a controlled precision that told Eleanor exactly how angry he truly was beneath his calm exterior. "This is Lady Margaret's doing," he said flatly. "I recognize the particular cruelty of it. She has never forgiven either of us for that night at her ball." "The debts are not entirely a fabrication," Eleanor admitted quietly, unable to meet his eyes. "My father did struggle terribly in his final years, though nothing so dishonest as this letter suggests. I did not tell you the full truth of it before our marriage, Julian, because I feared it would change your opinion of my family, and by extension, of me. The Duke rose from his desk and crossed to where she stood, taking her hands gently in his own. Eleanor, look at me. Do you believe, after everything we have shared these past months, that I would think less of you for your father's misfortune? A man's debts are not a reflection of his daughter's character, any more than my brother's death was a reflection of mine, and I have learned, thanks entirely to you, not to carry guilt that was never rightfully mine to bear. But society will not be so generous, Eleanor said. If this letter has already reached Lady Margaret and others, by tonight the whole county may believe I married you under false pretenses. Then we will address it together, the Duke said firmly, openly and honestly, rather than hiding from it as I once might have done. I am done letting fear and silence rule this house, Eleanor. I learned that lesson far too late with my brother's memory. I will not make the same mistake with my wife's reputation. Before the gathering that evening, Eleanor sought out Lady Constance once more, needing the old woman's steady counsel, as she had so often in the months since her arrival. She found her in the sitting room as always, though her health had grown noticeably more fragile in recent weeks, her hands thinner beneath their shawls, her breath a little shorter than before. You look as though the world has ended, Lady Constance said, studying Eleanor's pale face with sharp, assessing eyes. Someone has sent a letter accusing my family of dishonesty, my lady. I fear it will undo everything Julian and I have built these past months. Lady Constance's mouth thinned into a hard line. Lady Margaret Vale grows tiresome in her persistence. I had hoped she would learn her lesson after the ball, but it seems some lessons must be repeated before they finally take hold. She reached out and took Eleanor's hand, her grip surprisingly strong despite her frailty. Listen to me, child. My grandson has weathered far worse storms than a jealous woman's gossip. He weathered 7 years of silence and grief that nearly swallowed him whole, and he emerged from it because you were patient enough, and honest enough, and brave enough to wait for him on the other side. A letter full of half-truths and spite will not undo what the two of you have built together, not unless you allow it to. I am not certain how to stop it from spreading, my lady. You do not stop scandal by hiding from it, Lady Constance said firmly. You stop it by standing directly in its path and refusing to move. My grandson understands that better than he did a year ago, I think, thanks entirely to you. Trust him tonight. Let him fight this battle beside you, as a husband should, rather than trying to shield him from it out of some misplaced sense of duty. Eleanor left the sitting room with those words firmly in mind, and when the Duke had finished addressing his gathered guests that evening, she caught Lady Constance's eye across the drawing room and found the old woman watching the entire scene unfold with an expression of fierce, unmistakable pride. That evening, rather than waiting for the scandal to spread unchecked through whispered conversations and cruel speculation, the Duke did something entirely unexpected. He hosted a small gathering of his own, inviting the very same circle of society that had received Lady Margaret's poisonous letter, and stood before them in his own drawing room, with Eleanor at his side, her hand held firmly in his. I understand some of you may have received a certain anonymous letter recently, he began, his voice calm, but carrying easily across the room. Concerning my wife's family, I wish to address it directly, rather than allow whispers and half-truths to do the talking in my place. He spoke plainly of Eleanor's father's financial struggles, of the ordinary misfortune that had befallen many respectable families in recent years, of the debts that had been settled honestly, if painfully, through the sale of property rather than through any dishonest scheme. He spoke too, though Eleanor had not expected this part, of his own brother's death, of the 7 years of silence that had followed, and of how Eleanor's honesty and warmth had done more to heal his household than any amount of careful reputation management ever could have. I do not know who wrote that letter, he said finally, his eyes moving deliberately across the room until they settled, briefly, but pointedly, on Lady Margaret Vale, who stood near the back of the gathering with her composure visibly strained. But I would remind whoever did, that cruelty rarely achieves what it sets out to achieve. It has not weakened my regard for my wife in the slightest. If anything, it has only strengthened my resolve to defend her, publicly and without hesitation, exactly as I intend to do for the rest of our lives together. A murmur moved through the room, not the hungry, mocking whispers of the ball months before, but something closer to quiet approval, even admiration. Lady Margaret, cornered by the Duke's pointed gaze and the collective attention of the room now turning slowly toward her, offered no defense at all, only a stiff excuse about a prior engagement, before slipping quietly from the gathering altogether, and Eleanor understood, watching her go, that whatever power the woman had once held over their reputation had crumbled entirely in that single evening. In the weeks that followed, the scandal, such as it was, dissolved almost as quickly as it had appeared. Society, Eleanor discovered, had little appetite for pursuing a cruelty so thoroughly and publicly dismantled by the very man it had been designed to embarrass, and within a month, the entire affair had faded into little more than an unpleasant memory, discussed occasionally in hushed, almost admiring tones about how thoroughly the Duke of Ashcombe had defended his Duchess. Life at Ashcombe Hall settled, in the months that followed, into something Eleanor had never quite dared to imagine on that first frightened carriage ride through its gates. The garden bloomed fully by the following spring, roses climbing once more over the old stone walls exactly as they had in the Duke's mother's time, and Eleanor found herself, one warm afternoon, receiving an unexpected letter from that very woman, who had heard, through channels Eleanor never quite discovered, of the garden's restoration and of her son's newfound happiness, and who wrote, with cautious hope, of perhaps visiting Ashcombe Hall again after so many years away. The nursery, too, remained open, though it was no longer a shrine to grief alone. The Duke had taken in quiet moments to sitting there with Eleanor, sharing more memories of Henry, memories that grew gentler and more joyful with each retelling, until the room began to feel less like a tomb and more like a place where love, however painfully lost, could still be honored and remembered without breaking the one who remembered it. On a bright morning nearly a year after Eleanor's arrival at Ashcombe Hall, Mrs. Bennet found the Duke and Duchess together in the breakfast room, as had become their habit, but this time, something in the air between them seemed different, lighter, filled with a private joy neither of them could quite contain. "You seem in unusually fine spirits this morning, Your Grace," Mrs. Bennet observed, setting down a fresh pot of tea. The Duke glanced at Eleanor, who nodded with a small, encouraging smile, and he could not entirely suppress the grin that spread across his face, a grin so unguarded and boyish that Mrs. Bennet nearly dropped the teapot in astonishment. "We have news, Mrs. Bennet," he said. "Come spring, this house will have need of a nursery again, and this time, God willing, it will be filled with laughter rather than silence." Mrs. Bennet's hands flew to her mouth, tears springing immediately to her eyes, and within the hour, the news had spread through the entire household with the same swift, joyful reverence that had once greeted the discovery of the Duke's very first smile. Eleanor stood later that day in the walled garden she had brought back to life, watching her husband walk toward her across the lawn with an easy, open warmth that bore no resemblance at all to the cold, unreachable stranger who had greeted her on the stone steps of Ashcombe Hall a year before. He reached her side and drew her gently into his arms, resting one hand lightly against her still flat stomach, with an expression of wonder that made her heart ache with happiness. "I never smiled in this garden before you," he murmured against her hair. "I never smiled anywhere in this house, for 7 long years. I did not think I remembered how." "You remembered," Eleanor said softly, leaning into him. "You simply needed someone patient enough to wait for it." "I love you, Eleanor," he said, the words no longer surprising him as they had that stormy night months before, but settled now, certain and unwavering, a truth as solid as the stone walls around them, more than I ever believed myself capable of loving anything again. "And I love you," Eleanor answered, awkward blunders and all. He laughed then, a full, warm, unguarded sound that carried across the garden and into the open windows of the house beyond, where Mrs. Bennet, passing through the hall with an armful of fresh linens, paused to listen, smiling to herself at the sound that had once been so rare within these walls, and now filled them so completely. The Duke of Ashcombe had not smiled in 7 years, the old stories used to say, but standing in his garden that afternoon, wrapped around the awkward, honest, endlessly loving woman who had somehow found her way past every wall he had built around his heart, he could not remember, for the life of him, what it had ever felt like not to smile at all. That evening, they shared the news with Lady Constance, who received it with tears of unrestrained joy, declaring that she had waited 7 long years for exactly this kind of happiness to return to Ashcombe Hall, and that she intended to live long enough to see the child walk through its halls no matter what her doctors advised about resting. She insisted on writing to the Duke's mother that very night, certain that the news of a grandchild on the way would draw her back across the sea at last, and indeed, within a few months, a letter arrived confirming that she intended to return to England before the child's arrival, eager to mend what time and grief had broken between herself and her surviving son. The nursery, once sealed and silent for 7 long years, was slowly prepared once more, though this time Eleanor and the Duke undertook the task together, carefully setting aside a few of Henry's most treasured belongings, the chipped toy soldier, the crudely drawn dragon that had always been meant to be a horse, to be kept and shown to the new child one day as a way of honoring the uncle they would never meet, but would surely come to know through the stories their parents told. Word of the Duke's transformation spread slowly through the county over that year, no longer whispered as gossip but shared instead as something like inspiration, a quiet testament to the idea that even the coldest, most guarded hearts might still be reached, given enough patience, enough honesty, and enough genuine love. Lady Margaret Vale, for her part, was seen far less often in society after that final humiliating evening, and though she never publicly admitted to sending the letter, few who had witnessed the Duke's calm, devastating response ever doubted her involvement again. As for Eleanor, she never did learn to remember which fork belonged to which course, nor did she ever fully master the art of holding her tongue when honesty pressed too urgently against her lips. But she learned, in her year at Ashcombe Hall, something far more valuable than the rules of polite society. She learned that a house built on silence could be filled again with warmth, that grief carried alone could be lightened simply by being shared, and that the coldest, most unreachable of hearts might, given enough patience and enough honest love, learn to smile again, and once having learned, might never quite stop. Snow was falling the night the midwife finally emerged from the bedchamber, and Julian Ashcombe, who had faced down scandal and grief and 7 years of silence without once losing his composure, found his hands shaking so badly he could not hold the glass of brandy Mr. Hastings had pressed upon him hours before. "A daughter, Your Grace," the midwife said, and before she could say another word, Julian had pushed past her into the room, heedless of propriety, heedless of anything, except the sound of his wife's tired, joyful laughter and the thin, indignant cry of a newborn child. Eleanor looked exhausted and radiant all at once, propped against a mountain of pillows, a small bundle wrapped snugly in white linen, held carefully against her chest. She looked up as he entered, her face breaking into a smile so full of love that Julian felt his own eyes sting with sudden emotion. "Come and meet your daughter," she said softly. He crossed the room slowly, as though approaching something impossibly fragile, and sank onto the edge of the bed beside her, gazing down at the small, red-faced infant with a tuft of dark hair and eyes that were, even now, unmistakably his mother's shade of gray. "She is perfect," he whispered. "She has your stubbornness already," Eleanor said, laughing softly despite her exhaustion. "She fought the whole way into this world. I do not think she intends to do anything quietly, ever." "Good," Julian said, reaching out with careful, trembling fingers to touch the tiny hand that had curled instinctively around the edge of the blanket. This house could use a little more noise. They named her Henrietta, after the uncle she would never meet, and though Julian's voice caught slightly when he first said the name aloud, there was no grief left in it, only love, and a quiet, steady peace that had taken him nearly 8 years to find. Lady Constance, though her health had continued to decline through the winter, insisted on being carried into the room within the hour to see her first great-grandchild, and she held the infant with trembling but determined arms, tears streaming freely down her weathered face. "I told you," she said to Eleanor, her voice thick with emotion, "that you would be exactly what this house needed. I did not imagine, even in my most hopeful moments, quite how right I would prove to be." The Duke's mother arrived from the continent 3 weeks later, delayed by winter storms at sea, and though the reunion between mother and son began awkwardly, years of distance and grief not easily bridged in a single afternoon, something in the sight of the infant in her son's arms seemed to soften whatever remained of the old wounds between them. She stayed at Ashcombe Hall through the spring, and by the time she finally returned to the continent, she had promised to visit every year rather than staying away, and Julian, watching her carriage disappear down the drive, felt for the first time in a decade that his family, however scattered and imperfect, was slowly finding its way back together. Life at Ashcombe Hall settled, in the years that followed, into a warmth that none of the old servants could quite believe, having spent so many years accustomed to the quiet, grieving stillness that had once ruled the house. Henrietta grew quickly, inheriting her mother's blunt honesty and her father's quiet determination in equal measure, and by the time she was old enough to toddle unsteadily through the gardens, she had already earned a reputation among the staff for speaking her mind, with a frankness that left visiting guests either charmed or scandalized, depending entirely on their disposition. "She takes after you entirely," Julian said one afternoon, watching their daughter inform a visiting bishop, with great seriousness, that his hat looked remarkably like an overturned pudding bowl. The bishop, to his credit, had laughed heartily, and declared the child the most refreshingly honest person he had met in 20 years of society dinners. "She takes after both of us," Eleanor corrected, smiling as she watched her husband scoop their daughter up before she could deliver further critiques of the bishop's wardrobe. "I have simply given her permission to say aloud what you have always thought and been too polite to voice." 2 years later, A second child arrived, a son this time, quieter and more thoughtful than his sister, with his father's careful gray eyes and his mother's tendency to speak plainly when the moment called for it. They named him Edward, and Lady Constance, though frailer now and confined mostly to her rooms, lived just long enough to hold him in her arms and declare, with evident satisfaction, that Ashcombe Hall had never in all her many years known such happiness as it did now. She passed peacefully that following autumn, surrounded by the family she had worked so tirelessly to bring together, and though the house mourned her loss deeply, there was a gentleness to the grief this time, nothing like the sharp, silent wound that had once swallowed the household whole. Julian spoke at her funeral of her fierce love, her sharp wit, and her unwavering belief that honesty, however uncomfortable, was always preferable to polished pretense. And Eleanor, standing beside him with Henrietta's small hand in her own, understood that some of the very best parts of her husband, his loyalty, his quiet strength, his capacity to love deeply once he allowed himself to try, had come from the remarkable woman they now laid to rest. The walled garden, meanwhile, had grown into the most celebrated feature of the entire estate, visited by curious guests from neighboring counties who had heard tales of the Duchess's remarkable skill with roses that had once been given up for dead. Eleanor spent her mornings there still, often with one or both children trailing behind her, small hands clumsily helping to pull weeds or water the beds, and Julian joined them whenever his duties allowed, no longer a stranger to dirt beneath his fingernails or laughter carried on the morning air. On quiet evenings, after the children had been put to bed, Eleanor and Julian often found themselves in the long gallery, where they had first spoken honestly of Henry all those years before, standing together at the same tall window, watching whatever weather the sky offered that night. The storms no longer frightened him the way they once had. He had told her, quietly, one such evening, that he still thought of his brother every single day, but that the thought no longer came wrapped in guilt and silence. It came instead as warmth, as memory, as gratitude for the brief years they had shared together, and Eleanor understood that this, more than anything else, was the truest measure of how far he had come. Lady Margaret Vale, it was later learned through the quiet channels of county gossip, had eventually married a viscount from a neighboring shire, a match considered respectable enough by society's standards, though those who knew her well remarked that she never again attempted the kind of cruel scheming that had once nearly cost her everything at Ashcombe Hall. Eleanor, for her part, held no lasting bitterness toward the woman. She understood, better than most, what it was to feel unseen and undervalued, and though she never forgot the pain of that anonymous letter, she found she could not summon real anger toward someone who had, in her own bitter way, only wanted the same happiness Eleanor herself had been fortunate enough to find. The years brought other changes to Ashcombe Hall as well. The stables grew busier, filled once more with the sound of hooves and laughter, as Henrietta, true to her stubborn nature, insisted on learning to ride before she had properly learned to read, much to her governess's despair, and her father's quiet, proud amusement. Willow, the old gray mare that had once belonged to Julian's mother, lived long enough to carry Henrietta on her very first ride around the paddock, and when the old horse finally passed peacefully in her stall one winter, both children insisted on a small ceremony in the garden, burying a handful of her favorite treats beneath the roses Eleanor had brought back to life so many years before. Edward grew into a thoughtful, watchful boy, more inclined toward his father's books than his sister's boundless energy, though he shared Eleanor's habit of speaking plainly when a moment called for honesty rather than polish. He asked, once, at the age of 7, why the portrait of a boy he did not recognize hung in the long gallery beside the more familiar family paintings, and Julian, rather than deflecting the question as he might once have done, sat his son down and told him, gently and honestly, about the uncle he would never meet, about the accident that had taken him, and about the 7 long years of silence that had followed before Eleanor's arrival had finally coaxed warmth back into the house. "Were you very sad, Papa?" Edward asked, with the particular seriousness only a young child could summon. "I was," Julian admitted, "for a very long time. But your mother taught me that sadness does not have to last forever, even when it feels as though it might. She taught me that a person can grieve and still find joy again, if they are patient and honest, and willing to let someone else help carry the weight." Edward considered this with evident thoughtfulness before declaring that he intended to be exactly as brave and honest as his mother when he grew older, a statement that made Eleanor laugh so hard she had to excuse herself from the dinner table entirely, much to her son's confusion and her husband's evident delight. "Do you remember?" Eleanor asked him one evening, years after her arrival, as they stood together watching their children chase fireflies across the darkening lawn, "how frightened I was, riding through those gates for the first time. I was certain I had married the coldest man in England. Julian laughed, low and warm. An easy sound now, worn smooth by years of practice. I remember watching you stumble out of that carriage, and thinking I had never seen anyone so entirely unprepared for the life awaiting her, and yet so determined to face it honestly regardless. I fell in love with you a little that very day, though it took me far too long to admit it, even to myself. You hid it well, Eleanor teased. I hid everything well. Once, he agreed, drawing her close against his side as the last light faded from the sky above Ashcombe Hall, until you arrived and decided, quite without my permission, that I deserved to feel things again. Below them, Henrietta's delighted shriek rang out across the lawn as she caught a firefly cupped between her small hands, and Edward toddled after her, determined not to be outdone by his older sister, and the sound of their laughter, bright and unguarded, carried up through the open windows and filled every corner of a house that had once known nothing but silence. The Duke of Ashcombe had not smiled in 7 years, the old stories used to say, back when Eleanor first arrived as a nervous, awkward bride uncertain of her welcome. But standing now in the golden light of a summer evening, surrounded by the family he had built with the very woman society once mocked for her clumsy honesty, Julian understood that he had not merely learned to smile again in the years since her arrival. He had learned, more importantly, what it meant to build a life worth smiling for, one patient, honest day at a time. And he intended to spend every remaining day of his life, proving himself worthy of the woman who had taught him how.